Appendix 2, Scott Hafemann. Hafemann spelled out the point at issue. Paul views himself in his apostolic calling not only as one who preaches the message of good news to the world, but equally important, as one appointed by God to be an embodiment of that gospel, called to reveal the knowledge of God by and through his very life. In short, the apostolic message is embodied in the life of the apostle itself. That is what Paul had to learn. Yes, indeed. But Paul did not write his letter to the Corinthians, nor did the Spirit record and preserve that letter, just to let the Corinthians, and later believers even today, understand that this was Paul's ministry. The fact is, this is what the New Covenant ministry means for every single believer. The understanding to which Christ brought Paul through suffering is essential for every believer. More, it is a vital aspect of what it means to be a believer. In other words, weakness, made clear to the apostle by his suffering, is at the very heart of the New Covenant. It is the believer's life in weakness which conveys to the world the best picture of the Christian life, of the gospel, of the New Covenant, of Christ, and of God himself. It is not suffering as such. It is the thing that Paul's suffering taught him, namely, that his weakness was key. It was weakness that was the issue. It still is. Contrary as it is to the wisdom of this age, the truth is that it is through the believer's weakness that Christ reveals his glory to the world. And as Hafemann said in another place, God sent Paul to suffer as an apostle of the crucified Christ, carrying his treasure in a jar of clay. Paul did not represent Christ, embody the gospel he preached, or mediate the power of the Spirit through great displays of rhetorical power, political savvy, and personal strength, but by suffering. In calling Paul to be a minister of the New Covenant, God sentenced Paul to death. Or in the words of Paul in 2 Corinthians 2:14, God was always leading us to death in Christ, like a prisoner in a Roman triumphal procession. As he says elsewhere, I die every day. Paul's point is as simple as it is profound. Rather than calling his sufficiency into question, Paul's suffering, pictured under the metonymy of death, is the revelatory vehicle through which the knowledge of God, manifest in the cross of Christ and in the power of the Spirit, is disclosed. God uses Paul's suffering as the embodiment of the crucified Christ, as the instrument to display his resurrection power. Thus Paul's call to suffer as an apostle is the very means by which God makes his love and power known in the world for the proclamation and praise of his glory. If Paul's suffering is the means of God's self-revelation, then the manifestation of God's glory is its ultimate goal. Moreover, Paul affirms that whenever God's people, by trusting in God's love, power, and promises, endure the same sufferings to which he was called as an apostle, they too manifest the power and glory of God in the midst of their adversity. I break in to stress that Hafemann has reached a very serious point in his argument. All this about the important place of weakness applies not only to ministers, capital letters, allowing the word, but to ministers, small case, that is, to all believers, each and every last one of them. Moreover, Paul affirms that whenever God's people, not just ministers, by trusting in God's love, power, and promises, endure the same sufferings to which he was called as an apostle, they too manifest the power and glory of God in the midst of their adversity. Hafemann continued, emphasizing the point. God's goal in suffering, therefore, is to teach us, believers, that in life and in death, as in all eternity, God himself is all we ultimately need. God never intends to destroy his people, nor will he allow anyone or anything else to do so, nor can anything separate us from the love of God in Christ. In placing Paul in a situation in which he despaired even of life itself, the only thing God destroyed was Paul's self-confidence. In return, Paul received God himself. In response, Paul gave God praise. In the three thesis statements of 1 Corinthians 4:9, 2 Corinthians 2:14, and 4:11, Paul therefore gives the theological basis for his conviction that his suffering, like the death of Jesus, mediates the resurrection power of God, that is, the life of Jesus. Here Paul asserts that his sufferings are not merely coincidental, but are part of the divine plan for the spread of the gospel. Since God's power is expressed through Paul's weakness, moreover, with the death of Christ as its backdrop, these passages portray Paul's suffering under the imagery of death. In two of the passages, this is done by means of a metaphor, 1 Corinthians 4:9, being sentenced to death in the arena, 2 Corinthians 2:14, being led to death in the triumphal procession. In 2 Corinthians 4:11, Paul explicitly associates his suffering with the death of Jesus itself. In each case, Paul views his suffering to be a divinely orchestrated death that, like the cross of Christ, performs a revelatory function. And that function is, of course, the glory of God. Contrary to the wisdom of the age, neither greatness or success, popularity or personality is the measure of the quality of spiritual service. In stark contrast to that worldly wisdom, a sense of weakness taught in Paul's case by suffering is, contrary to received wisdom, weakness is what Christ looks for and uses. What recommended Paul as a true representative of Jesus Christ was his life of suffering as the means for mediating the transforming work of the Spirit, not his personality or his success in growing, that is, producing larger churches. I break in to say that Paul's concern would not have been attendance numbers. For him, the spiritual quality of this ecclesia would have been paramount. The same goes for Christ's addresses in Revelation 2 and 3. Hafemann went on, Paul's understanding of the nature of Christian ministry thus strikes a piercing blow against all attempts, whether in Paul's day or our own, to fashion ministries and messages around techniques and technology. Second, as the corollary to Paul's argument from his own suffering and the Spirit, not suffering versus the Spirit, Paul's portrayal of his ministry also calls into question our image of the Spirit-filled Christian. Like Paul's opponents, we too find it hard to shake off the health and wealth gospel with its promises of God's physical and financial blessing for the faithful. In our age of materialism, we find it almost impossible to accept that God will not only use suffering as the vehicle for manifesting the presence and power of the Spirit, but that he would also lead someone to death for the sake of revealing his glory and spreading the gospel. In its place, we strive hard to give the impression that Christians are a people who overcome suffering and want, rather than those who find Christ strong in their very evident weakness. Though we do not often overtly express it, deep down we are still convinced that if we just had enough faith, we should be able to beat or avoid the adversity around us. We believe somehow that true followers of Christ should not have to endure the kind of health problems and heartache known to our neighbours. Hafemann, alas, moved into Christendom mode. This health and wealth assumption is even more evident in regard to, allowing the term, pastors, both in terms of our expectations for them and in regard to their own self-understandings. We naturally assume that the handsome and healthy are strong in the Lord, especially, above all, I would say, if they are skilled rhetorically. Yet from Paul's perspective, the dominant characteristic of those in whom God is mightily at work is their confident endurance in the midst of adversity. Our pastors are to model perseverance, not personality, morality, not miracles, Hence, with Paul as their example, pastors should not be surprised when God's leading takes them into deeper waters of suffering than those experienced by their, oh, what a remarkable word, that's my comment, people. This is especially true of the suffering caused by the anxiety they will experience over the spiritual health of, allowing the term again, their churches. A pastor's heart is a broken heart. And although the church in the West is not presently suffering the persecution so common elsewhere in the world, many pastors today, like Paul in Corinth, will have to endure the low-grade but very discouraging suffering that comes from financial uncertainty, underpayment, and cultural disdain. Sheep go where the shepherds lead. Congregations take on the vision and values of their pastors. Paul's argument in 2 Corinthians is that his own sufferings as an apostle therefore provides the antidote to the church's this worldly short-sightedness. In the same way today, rather than portraying the persona of the successful leader, pastors are to take the lead in suffering for the sake of the gospel because of their confidence in the surpassing worth of the glory that outweighs our light and momentary troubles. Hafemann, recovering to the New Covenant mode, published a needful warning. At the same time, it must be emphasized that suffering in and of itself is not the revelation of God's power. Paul never glories in affliction per se. Suffering and oppression in themselves do not mark one out as a representative of Christ in the world. Paul has no romantic notion of suffering. He suffered too much for that. Indeed, by itself, suffering is the consequence of sin. To experience suffering is to be impacted by the evil of our fallen world. Left to itself, suffering is not a noble and purifying virtue. There is no evidence that Paul sought suffering or encouraged others to do so as if it were a sign of special spirituality. He suffered because of God's leading and because of his own seeking of the kingdom, not because he tried to suffer. Hence the emphasis among some of the early fathers on actively seeking martyrdom as the highest form of Christian witness is a dangerous misapplication of Paul's view of suffering. Believers are, therefore, to avoid circumstantial suffering and persecution whenever such avoidance does not hinder or compromise their calling, and to pray for healing and deliverance when sick. But the righteous do suffer. Alas, Hafemann once again dropped into Christendom speak, and some, like Paul and those called to minister the gospel as representatives of Christ. Contrary to Hafemann's implication, this is not restricted to a few believers. All believers are called to this. That's my comment. These ministers are even called, believers I would say, are even called to do so for the sake of the gospel. God makes known his sovereignty and love by handing Paul over to death, and then sustaining him through it so that he may be able to endure in faith. Finally, Paul's experience as an apostle leads to the conclusion that those called, as before, all believers, I would say, to proclaim and embody the kingdom are called to a unique role within the church. Through their lives of trust, integrity, and mercy, in the midst of adversity, the saints entrusted to their care will see displayed before them the reality of Christ's death and resurrection. This implies that the life of the pastor will normally be characterized by a quality and quantity of suffering not usually expected in the lives of those gifted for other equally important roles within the church. If the goal of Paul's ministry was to bring about the endurance of faith in the lives of God's people, the means to that end was for Paul to live his own life of faith as a servant of the new covenant, publicly before them. By watching their apostle, the Corinthians see the comfort of God fleshed out in Paul's experience. Hence, the movement from God to Paul to the Corinthians illustrates that God calls those in ministry, I would say every believer, to be an example to the church. Hafemann rightly came to the present day, rightly rebuking contemporary evangelicalism. In the midst of a contemporary church that is often caught up in techniques and technology as the way to grow, that is, increase the membership or at least the number of attenders at a church, the seeming be-all and end-all of many evangelicals today, I would say, Paul's message in 2 Corinthians reminds us that just as redemption took place through the coming of Christ, so too God's plan for strengthening the faith of his people is not ultimately a program, but a person. The life and proclamation of the believer is the primary way God grows, that is, increases his church. Sadly, Hafemann returned to his Christendom mode, but I quote him hoping that you, listener, will make his point general and applicable to all, including yourself. And at the heart of the pastoral office is the suffering of the pastor, even as Christ came as a suffering servant who was obedient to the point of death. In an age when pastors are being increasingly reconfigured as professional therapists, business managers, and coaches in the games of life, such an understanding seems as strange as it is needed.